What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review Spider-Man Brand New Day, and judging by the reaction that I saw in the theater tonight, as well as the reaction that I had personally, I think there's a very good chance this movie is going to be the highest grossing movie of 2026. And I'm not trying to say it's the best movie of 2026, but I think it's going to be the most popular movie of 2026. And I know that's going to sound a little crazy coming out of my mouth, given all the negative reviews I've given to superhero movies in recent years, but this was the first superhero movie that I've seen in several years where there wasn't a single ingredient throughout the entire movie that made me want to projectile vomit or have projectile diarrhea, projectile something in all directions. It's a very solid movie from start to finish. It's too long. Doesn't really have much of like a villain, but it's very enjoyable. It's got great characters, it's got great emotional beats, and it's got some killer fight scenes. And when it comes to superhero movies, usually when it comes to the big marquee characters, whether it's Spider-Man or Batman or any of the characters where their appeal will basically be until the end of time, like those characters are never going away. But if you can deliver a few good action set pieces and a few great character beats and some genuine stirring emotion, well then you're probably going to make somewhere between $1 and $2 billion. And in the last Spider-Man movie did gross $1.92 billion. Who knows how well this movie is going to perform, because it doesn't have Doctor Strange, it doesn't have Tobey Maguire, it doesn't have Andrew Garfield, but it has a lot of other people, one of which it's not a spoiler because it's out there on the internet, but I'm going to do a non-spoiler section and a spoiler section, just in case there are a few people watching this video who don't spend too much time online. I'll keep a few secrets in reserve for the latter part of my video, and I'll give you a big verbal warning as well as a time code below before diving into any spoilers. But if you're unfamiliar with the premise for the movie, here's what they have to say over on IMDb. A forgotten Peter Parker lives alone as a full-time Spider-Man until mounting pressure triggers a dangerous change and a powerful new enemy emerges. The only revision I'd make to that: powerful new antagonist, not necessarily a powerful new enemy. Although there are some classic Spider-Man villains scattered throughout this movie. Some in very, very small, like bite-sized chunks. I was hoping for a lot more of some of these classic characters. But if you're a fan of the Scorpion, and if you're a fan of classic Spider-Man comics, going back to the days of like the early mid-60s, it's hard to find a villain that's more classic than the Scorpion, because he first appeared in Spider-Man or Amazing Spider-Man number 20 way back in the day, and he's been through many evolutions over the years, but I'm always happy to see the Scorpion being put to good use. But when it comes to the other characters in this movie, I've heard a lot of people describing it as overstuffed. I wouldn't describe the movie as overstuffed, because some of these characters, like you'll blink and you'll miss them, but what it feels a lot like, it's a little bit like somebody came home from school and had like a big box full of all their favorite action figures, all Marvel figures, dumped them all on the floor and just started playing with the first ones that their hands found. Like, well, it doesn't really make sense that this character would be in this person's story or this person would be in that person's story, but fuck it, I'm playing with these figures. And the reason I'm being so vague is that there's one major character who is not a secret, but is, I guess, more or less going to be a secret until tomorrow or Friday, in terms of their involvement in the story and what potential stories that character might unlock for the MCU in the years to come. But it's hard to put into words what a relief it is to talk about a superhero movie for once on this channel without constantly talking shit about all of its shortcomings. So let's talk about some of the things that this movie really gets right. There's a sadness to Peter in this movie, which is very, very true to the comics, or at least the spirit of the comics in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. I didn't read a ton of Spider-Man comics in the 21st century, or if I did, he was appearing in the pages of other comics, like when he joined the Fantastic Four, when Jonathan Hickman was writing them, or when he joined the Avengers, when Brian Michael Bendis was writing them. Like, he would appear in comics that I was reading, but I was regularly and religiously buying Spider-Man comics back in the 80s. And at the same time, even though we had Amazing Spider-Man and Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, my dad was giving me copies of what was called Marvel Tales at that time. And Marvel Tales in the 80s would reprint Spider-Man comics from the early 60s. That way I was basically getting like the origins of his character and the origins of all of his best villains, while at the same time enjoying the great heyday of the character in the 1980s, where the character was so popular and the stories were so strong, he kept spilling over into new titles, because we had Amazing Spider-Man and we had Spectacular Spider-Man. Then they launched Web of Spider-Man sometime around like 83 or 84, and then that proved to be so popular. Eventually they just launched Spider-Man, which was drawn by Todd McFarlane. But it sounds crazy to say, but at one time, 4 different Spider-Man comics were coexisting peacefully. And then also, of course, Marvel Tales, which was reprinting the classic Spider-Man comics. Basically, you could throw a rock in a comic shop and you were probably going to land on a Spider-Man comic. And of course, we had like the animated show, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and that sort of thing.
Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends.
He was appearing on the Electric Company. It was a great time to be a Spider-Man fan, but what was unique about the character whether you're talking about the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or any decade in the 21st century, I feel like if you're a fan of the character in any era, there have been cool movies or cool games or cool comics or cool animated series to follow, which is why after more than 60 years, he is easily the most popular superhero on planet Earth. And as long as you continue to deliver really solid experiences like Spider-Man Brand New Day, it wouldn't surprise me at all if he's just as popular in another 60 years. And the reason I know this is because I have a nephew who's almost 5 years old, and his favorite thing to do is to sit on the sofa in his Spider-Man outfit, watching Spider-Man cartoons or watching Spider-Man movies. So something tells me his interest in the character is going to last for a good long while, especially once he sees Spider-Man Brand New Day, which I think is a good chance of just making him shit his pants. Because if you look at all the Spider-Man movies that have been made, basically since the first one by Sam Raimi in the early 2000s, this is one of the good ones. And there's several ingredients that this movie handles really well. But if I had to put my finger on the best ingredient by far, they really nail the sadness and the isolation and the loneliness that Spider-Man frequently experiences in some of the best comics. Because going back to the days of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko up through the 1980s, he usually had relationship problems, money problems, and family problems, as well as villains trying to kill him. And he was always completely stressed out, trying to juggle all these concerns at the same time. And at the beginning of this movie, thanks to the events of Spider-Man No Way Home, he's very much isolated and on his own. He doesn't have Aunt May. He doesn't have his closest friends. He doesn't have the Avengers in his life anymore. He is all by his lonesome. And so you can really feel that sadness just kind of coming off of him in waves. And when he's out in public interacting with people and saving people's lives, he remains absolutely your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. But when he's at home, he's wrestling with several issues at the same time. And I feel like that's really like the essence of the character as he was defined by Stan Lee in the early 60s. And another thing along those lines that this movie really nails, the look of Spider-Man. We've had so many Spider-Man movies at this point. We had, 3 Tobey movies, well, I guess 4 if you can count No Way Home, 2 Andrew Garfield movies, or 3 if you include No Way Home. We've had now 4 Tom Holland Spider-Man movies, but he appeared in 3 Avengers movies, or Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame. And of course we've had 2 Spider-Verse movies, but it's amazing just how infrequently a big, popular, robust franchise like this manages to get the costume right. And if you go back to the days of John Romita in the 60s. So I believe it's the first artist to take over after Steve Ditko left Amazing Spider-Man and went over to Doctor Strange. But at least this trade paperback starts with issue 39 with this classic cover where he's being captured by the Green Goblin. In any case, great little collection of John Romita in his heyday. And that's John Romita Sr., his son, John Romita Jr. Well, he's still big, but he was huge in the 80s when he was drawing Uncanny X-Men and things like that. But in the 60s, John Romita Sr., he was one of the kings of comics, and he really knew how to draw Spider-Man. But in this movie, you can't criticize anything when it comes to the look. Everything from the belt to the goggles to everything about it's wow. And even the way he'll respond to people while talking to them, how his eyes are expressive, how they'll kind of close or widen just to show a little bit of emotion. They just nail it. And I guess this is all a long-winded way of saying it's so obvious when a superhero movie gets everything right and why it becomes popular and why it delivers. And this movie is going to deliver some serious money. But it's enough to make you wonder, how come they can't do it like that every single time? Because the filmmakers who made this movie, they're not necessarily the world's greatest filmmakers or the world's greatest writers. They're very solid and they work consistently. But writers Chris McKenna and Eric Summers, along with director Destin Daniel Cretton, nothing they've ever made in the past has made me think, oh, these guys are just going to be the kings of superhero movies moving forward. They're going to deliver potentially the highest grossing movie of 2026. But that's precisely what they've done. And I think there's a major lesson to be learned when it comes to adapting any popular character who's been around for 30, 40, 50, or 60 years. Figure out what is the essence of that character, what's made them enduringly popular for so many decades, and stick to it. And of course, there's room to reinvent a character every now and then. I mean, famously, back in Secret Wars in the 1980s, Spider-Man got his black suit. And when I was a little kid, I was like, oh, shit, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen. And, they still haven't quite figured out how to do the black suit on screen as it was done in the original Secret Wars written by Jim Shooter back in the day. But who knows? Maybe in the Secret Wars movie coming out in 2 years, or I don't know when it's coming out, but maybe they'll finally crack that code. But another aspect of Spider-Man, or just superhero movies more broadly, that this movie really gets right, it nails the private life and the public life of the character in like it with equal force or with equal enthusiasm, and that's very rare. Like take a character like Batman. He's really tough to get because you have to get Bruce Wayne at home. You have to get the public Bruce Wayne that interacts with the outside world where he's kind of putting on a show. And you have to get Batman. You have to get all three of those characters right. So that's always a big creative challenge for any Batman movie. And I thought that was one of the big failures of Superman last year. They kind of nailed Clark Kent, but he just felt like Clark Kent when he was still in the suit interacting with the outside world. Like, no, let him be calm and collected and cool. Let him be Superman. And they haven't really let him be Superman yet. This movie really lets Tom Holland lean all the way in on Peter Parker and all of his insecurities and all of his sadness and all of his isolation, while at the same time really nailing Spider-Man in action. And director Destin Daniel Cretton, he's really leveled up with this movie because I wasn't that impressed with the Shang-Chi film. I thought it basically was a big, giant missed opportunity to capture the essence of that character where it's basically, if you go back to the 1970s when Master of Kung Fu was it was an obscure comic but a popular comic, they basically took Bruce Lee, James Bond, stirred them together, and boom, you had Shang-Chi, Master of Kung Fu. And the movie that we got, I was like, well, y'all are going in a very different direction. Like, best of luck to you. But with this movie, you could tell that Destin Daniel Cretton was trying to lean into everything that everybody loves about this character. And I liked how every once in a while, he'll tip his hat to the past. And people have been talking about this for months. But there are a lot of shots in the movie early on, which are very reminiscent of some classic comic book covers. And of course, with the comic book cover, the dimensions are like this. It's actually much more like you're looking at somebody's phone as opposed to movies, which are sideways. So you can't do it perfectly because with a movie, if you're dealing with a movie that's either 2.25 to 1 or 1.85 to 1, you cannot do a comic book cover perfectly, but it more or less captures the essence of like Amazing Fantasy 15 and what were some of the other ones? So there's this cover from Amazing Spider-Man 221, and there's this cover by Eric Larson for Amazing Spider-Man 345, which I actually bought off the rack back in the day, or maybe it arrived in the mail through a subscription. In any case, that comic is in my collection. But Easter eggs and cameos will only get you but so far. Eventually, you have to tell an emotionally compelling story, an emotionally gripping story with all the thrills, chills, suspense, and delight that a superhero movie can provide. And there are a few points in this movie, like when Spider-Man's going up against Savage Hulk, and not the Bruce Banner Hulk that we saw in Avengers Endgame. We see that for a little while, but then we get to see the real deal, like the Incredible Hulk that we really haven't seen since he got his ass kicked by Thanos back in 2018 at the beginning of Avengers Infinity War. It's like, it's amazing. It's been 8 years since we've seen, Hulk smash on the big screen.
You're not gonna get away with this.
But he might.
I didn't know you could get that big.
And this movie absolutely delivers, where Spider-Man and Punisher, neither of whom are remotely on his level, are doing their best just trying not to get killed. And what I like about this movie, it doesn't do that thing where every single superhero has to be equally powerful. Like one of the earliest comic books that I got way back in the day was this Frank Miller Amazing Spider-Man Annual. Hang on, I've got a reprint of it here. It was, here it is. It was the Amazing Spider-Man King Size Annual number 15. But at the back of that book, they had a power ranking of every single Marvel character at the time, or at least all the Marvel heroes, and it ranked them from the strongest to the weakest, just in terms of pure, raw physical strength. And of course, it started with Hulk and Thor, and it worked its way down. But I think a mistake a lot of the Marvel movies make is that they try to make everybody equally powerful. Like Black Widow with her little stun batons should not be as powerful as like Vision, flying around. Like there are like superheroes that have the power of gods, and there's some superheroes where they're just like a guy in a funny suit. Like Hawkeye even says that at one point in the original Secret Wars from the 1980s when he starts to run out of arrows or special arrows. And he's like, well, all of you have special abilities. When I run out of arrows, I'm just a guy in a funny suit. But I think too many filmmakers, they forget that there are levels to power. And this movie remembers Hulk is way up here, Spider-Man's down here, and the Punisher's down here. And they're not on a level playing field. So if you just want to see Spider-Man fighting the Hand, or Spider-Man fighting Scorpion, or Spider-Man fighting the Hulk, this movie's got you covered. But for the people who want a little more heartfelt emotion, a little bit more romance, Tom Holland and Zendaya also have you covered. And it's funny, having just seen The Odyssey recently, where I thought neither one of them were particularly good in the movie. I mean, Zendaya's barely in it, but Tom Holland I thought was easily the worst actor in the movie. One of the worst actors that I've ever seen, but he's fucking great. as Peter Parker. I don't get how he can be so good at playing Peter Parker. And also, it's not his accent. He's from the UK. He does not speak like a kid from Queens unless he's playing Peter Parker, where somehow he just everything you know and love about the character of Peter Parker, Tom Holland just has it dialed in. But the chemistry between Zendaya and Tom Holland is particularly good in this movie. And I would argue that when it comes to their relationship, I think this is the most interesting of the 4 movies that they've been in together, where you probably because Peter Parker spends so much of the movie like missing his friends and wanting to have Ned and MJ back in his life, that when they finally start spending time together again, you can feel like this palpable sense of relief, like, oh, like the buddies, they're hanging out again, they're making nerdy references to movies and talking about science and all that kind of stuff. Or maybe just Zendaya and Tom Holland, they've gotten old enough now, mature enough now, where they really know how to deliver the sizzle and the romance and all the feeling that fans want. Because at this point, yeah, they are the most powerful, like Hollywood couple, or the most powerful Hollywood romance in the biz. I mean, the fact is, for the next month, whether you like it or not, anytime you go to the movies, you're going to be picking one of 2 movies, both of which star Tom Holland and Zendaya. So it's tough to remember the last time a Hollywood couple has been this popular and been in this many big movies. Like Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, they were a big power couple, but like the movies they made together, like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, they were not on the level of Spider-Man Brand New Day, at least in terms of commercial appeal. So yeah, this is a rare thing, and who knows how long it'll last, but for the time being, yeah, it's a good time to be in either of their shoes. And the movie's got some legit laughs as well, but they come from a very unpredictable or very unusual source, because they come from Jon Bernthal, a.k.a. Frank Castle, a.k.a. The Punisher. And anybody who's seen season 2 of the original Daredevil might be thinking to themselves, like, well, he's not a very funny character. He's a pretty savage, merciless, bloodthirsty guy in a lot of respects. And it's funny, I was so concerned going into this movie that we would see like a softened PG-13 kind of lame version of Frank Castle. And he's obviously, it's a much more family-friendly interpretation, but they found a way to put him to good use, where his personality and his persona are in such stark contrast to Peter Parker, it inevitably leads to some really funny scenes. Arguably some of the funniest scenes I've seen in Marvel in years, because we're suffering through a horrible phase right now where a lot of movies are trying to copy the really lame Marvel trend, where every emotional beat or every moment of actual meaning is always kind of immediately dispelled or kind of ruined by a stupid quip or a stupid one-liner, where you're never allowed to kind of sink into the emotion of a scene, because inevitably someone like Ryan Reynolds is going to say something stupid. The humor here is similar but different enough where it never seems to dispel the overall mood of the movie. So Jon Bernthal, yeah, I think a lot of people are going to come away from this movie and say that he kind of stole the show, because he's used in small quantities, but when he's used for maximum impact. And also, as far as the world of Spider-Man is concerned, there are a few comic book covers more iconic than Amazing Spider-Man 129, where they find a way to incorporate this into the story of the movie in a really interesting way, which I also, once again, I like it when a movie or superhero movie is able to tip its hat to the past without being completely consumed by Easter eggs and kind of pop culture references. And as far as some of the other characters are concerned, there's a blink and you'll miss it appearance by Tarantula. And the cover they use in the movie is from Amazing Spider-Man 134. The cover I would have recommended is a childhood fave from 233. And I always loved covers that had multiple panels and kind of told a story within the cover. And of course, I enjoy a big splash page as well. But it's always fun, just for the sake of variety, having a little story within the story on the cover, even if it never actually appears in the issue in question. But there's a major Spider-Man character who appears in this movie, which a lot of people might not have heard of, but Jean DeWolf, who eventually in the comics became Captain DeWolf. But how can I say this without giving away spoilers? There's an arc, a really dark arc by Peter David from the 1980s, where if they wanted to go into that story in the next Spider-Man movie, she's now been set up. She's a recurring character, and she has some interesting chemistry with Spider-Man, where basically she's like the Commissioner Gordon to Batman, where she's a cop who basically is like, as long as you don't break a lot of rules or step out of line, feel free to come hang out with the police, and we can work in tandem with each other. And so I hope, once again, I got to be very delicate. Well, just go online. Just Google what happened to Detective, a.k.a. Captain Jean DeWolf, in the comics in the 1980s. And you'll be like, whoa, okay. Yeah, that would be fresh terrain for the Spider-Man universe. But it's the kind of story that plays to the strengths of Spider-Man as a character that I alluded to earlier. in the video. But as far as flaws of this movie are concerned, it definitely overstays its welcome. I would struggle to watch this movie 3, 4, 5, 6 times like I did with Spider-Man 2, the second Sam Raimi movie, where that movie was just so goddamn enjoyable. I could basically watch that movie anytime just for the opening credit sequence. You're like, okay, can we just watch this on a loop? We're hearing that Danny Elfman score and they're showing all that Alex Ross art. It's like, yeah, this is Spider-Man. And I don't know if the franchise will ever reach those heights again creatively. And when you're watching this movie, there's so many scenes where like, all right, that's 5 minutes of filler that could go. That's 5 minutes of filler that could go. There's definitely a 2-hour airtight, like maximum impact killer Spider-Man movie hidden within the 2-hour, 25-minute running time. But obviously at this point, I mean, the character is so popular and the movie is so enjoyable, it's not going to really have an impact. But who knows? Let's say the movie grosses $1.5 billion. Maybe it would gross $2 billion if they really tightened the screws and delivered the best possible movie. And my final complaint, or not complaint, but my final observation, I can't go into without going into some spoilers. So this is going to be my spoiler warning, 3, 2, 1. But I can't discuss the antagonist of the movie without revealing quite a lot. So if you don't want to hear any secrets, so long. Thank you so much for watching the video this long.
Okay, true believers, here he is, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Today's episode, Spidey meets the spoiler.
But now let's get into not the enemy or not the villain of the story, but the main antagonist, Jean Grey, a.k.a. Marvel Girl, who eventually became Phoenix, who eventually became Dark Phoenix, who eventually had a clone by the name of Madeline Pryor, who eventually, Jean Grey came back to life. And anyway, to put it mildly, when I was a kid, I think I was in love with Jean Grey. I was obsessed with Jean Grey. And to the present day, at age 50, I still have a framed Jean Grey poster on my wall. And if you've not read X-Men 137, or if you cannot tell me what happens in this story, well, then I hate to sound like a gatekeeper, but you're not a true comic book fan. Because for me, the moment Jean Grey, from the moment she becomes Phoenix, which I think was the end of Uncanny X-Men 100 and the beginning of 101, up through her death in Uncanny X-Men 137, it's one of the all-time great character arcs for any character. So for me, when I think of Jean Grey, I think of writer Chris Claremont, as well as artist Dave Cockrum, and obviously John Byrne, who really sold her best stories. In any case, she is here in this movie, and she's not a villain. She's kind of like, a misunderstood villain. Like, you can definitely understand her motivations and why she's possessing all these different people and what she's trying to achieve. But a movie without a villain struggles in the sense that, like, superhero movies do need a bad guy. Like, I thought one of the big fatal flaws of The Batman by Matt Reeves was that in the final third of the movie, he doesn't fight a villain. He's fighting, like, water. And it's like, all right, well, that's fine. He's saving people. But Batman should fight Catwoman, or he should fight the Riddler, or he should fight somebody at the end of, somebody in a suit should fight him. And in Spider-Man Brand New Day, he's having to fight multiple adversaries to try to get to Jean. But in the end, I think if there is a big, giant hole at the center of this movie, it's the lack of a classic villain. Because honestly, Jean Grey and Spider-Man, it's a little bit like taking two completely random flavors that you've never put together before and stirring them together to see what happens. Like, they have almost no shared history of any kind in the comics. However, in the 1980s, when it came to the popularity of Marvel characters, like, by far and away, without question, the most popular books out there, Uncanny X-Men and Amazing Spider-Man. If you went into a comic book shop in the early 1990s, every single poster in there would either be Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man or Jim Lee's X-Men. Those two characters sold a lot of books, and famously, both of their relaunches sold comics in the millions in the early 90s. When people want to know, like, why are superheroes so popular to the present day, it's because millions of people were buying these stories decades ago. And when it comes to Sadie Sink's portrayal of the character, I thought she did an excellent job, and I can easily watch her in the role for years to come. But my question is, how is this going to lead into future stories? Because there's no clear roadmap or no clear, organic, natural, next step from this movie. And keep in mind, Avengers Doomsday was supposed to come out before this movie. It got postponed. So you never know what's going to happen to the X-Men in Doomsday that's going to open the door to other interpretations or other actors playing these beloved characters. But it's one of those things where, sometimes release dates and delayed schedules, it's hard to have a shared universe. That's why very few people have been able to make it work. But when you're watching this movie, you're like, all right, well, at the end of the movie, is she going to get a call from Charles Xavier saying, like, oh, Jean, I've been looking for you. You should come live with us, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really tee anything up or set anything up. I'm like, then why why Jean Grey? Like, there's so many major characters that have appeared in the pages of Spider-Man across the last 60 years. It just felt completely, totally random, where I love the character, and I think Sadie Sink did an excellent job, but I was just kind of like, huh? Like, I just kept coming back to the central question of, why Jean Grey? And if at last week at Comic-Con, if Kevin Feige had walked out into the stage of Hall H and said, we've got Ghost Rider and Black Panther 3 and all these things that we're real excited about, but what we're really excited about is the next 20 years of X-Men movies. So meet your starting lineup, and had Sadie Sink walk out there and introduce the rest of the people who are going to be playing all the classic X-Men characters. But obviously, we don't know which characters are going to kind of be revamped or relaunched until we know which characters are going to be killed in Avengers Doomsday. But all those actors that played the X-Men starting in 2000 with the original Bryan Singer movie, they've been playing those roles for like 26 years, and they rebooted some of them. I mean, the less said about Sophie Turner as Jean Grey, the better. Give me Famke Janssen, or however you say her name, like, all day, every day. I mean, Sophie Turner and what they did with the Dark Phoenix movie, like, it's incredible to me how already we've seen so many attempts at doing the Dark Phoenix storyline that have ended in total disaster. We had X-Men 3 Last Stand, they totally screwed it up, and we had a Dark Phoenix movie which screwed it up even worse. And huge shocker, Simon Kinberg was involved in both of those interpretations as either a writer or director, or both. So let's just say, thank God they've gotten rid of Sophie Turner's interpretation of the character, and I think Sadie Sink is going to be a much better fit moving forward. But it wouldn't surprise me after the dust is settled and this movie's made, $500 million in its opening weekend, or however much money it ends up making. But it wouldn't surprise me at all after the initial kind of like fanfare subsides, as some people are like, well, wait a second. Why was Jean Grey the villain of that movie? Because Spider-Man's one of those rare heroes where he has one of the deepest benches when it comes to a rogues gallery of any hero. And people are always having these debates like, who's got the best villains? And I would probably argue that the X-Men have the best villains by far, my favorite villains. But strong contenders would be Batman and Spider-Man. And Spider-Man, starting in the early 60s up through basically like the early 2000s, they were constantly either reinventing the classic villains, making them fresh and exciting again. Like, for me, one of my favorite villains from my childhood was Hobgoblin, which is basically just a revamped Green Goblin. But I didn't care because Hobgoblin was fucking cool in the 1980s. I loved Hobgoblin. But Spider-Man has so many brilliant villains that you could tap into. I think that some people are going to be a little bit bewildered and confused as to why we didn't get more of the classic villains in this movie, because Tombstone shows up for like 5 seconds, and I love Tombstone back in the day, but he's there. I mean, he's like, once again, a blink and you'll miss an appearance by that character. And while Scorpion's in this movie about 5 or 10 minutes, what this movie's really missing is one of the great iconic Spider-Man villains. And obviously we got spoiled rotten in the previous one where we had a lot of his classic villains all in one movie. But I think the absence of a classic villain is going to be the biggest source of ongoing discussion about the pros and cons of what this movie has to offer. But speaking of villains, now that we're in the spoiler section, let's talk about Sin Eater and whether or not Sin Eater will appear in the next Spider-Man movie. Sin Eater's not a major villain. He looks cool, but he's basically the Punisher with like fewer toys and gadgets. He basically pulls on like a ski mask and has a shotgun and shoots people. It's like he's super complex villain, but he did murder Jean DeWolf, and it was a really dark, evil moment. I remember as a kid, I was like, Jesus Christ. And as I was walking into the theater tonight, this is how you know you're surrounded by some genuine comic book freaks. There was somebody wearing a t-shirt with this cover from Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man 107, when he's reacting to the death of Jean DeWolf. And I was like, whoa. I was like, I had to kind of scratch my head. I was like, why do I remember that cover? Oh, yeah, going back to, to that storyline back in the day. But, yeah, you could tell that was a diehard Spider-Man fan. But I don't think Sin Eater's enough of a classic character where you could kind of build an entire movie around him. Sadly, Sony kind of screwed themselves by using up a lot of their best villains in these ridiculous standalone movies like Morbius and Venom and Kraven. I mean, I was ransacking all my comic collection earlier. Kraven's Last Hunt is one of the coolest comic book arcs in the history of Spider-Man, and they basically took the character of Kraven. That's the end of Kraven's story after like 20 years of being like one of the main villains for Spider-Man. But they took this incredible character and just threw everything out and reinvented this ridiculous bullshit. But Sony, it's amazing that they can get a movie like this so right, like more or less from start to finish, and completely, totally shit the bed when it comes to their villain movies. And it just shows you really got to pick and choose your writers and your directors very carefully, because I think we have a problem now where there are a lot of filmmakers and a lot of writers working in film and television where they grew up watching superhero movies or superhero shows, but they did not grow up reading comics. Whereas people like Sam Raimi or like Joss Whedon or James Gunn, a lot of these guys who kind of helped make superhero movies popular in the earlier part of the 21st century, they did grow up reading hundreds of, if not thousands of comics. And back then the question always was, or the discussion always was, wouldn't it be cool if somebody could, do these stories right on the big screen? And of course, every once in a while we'd get something like Tim Burton's Batman, but they were very, very rare. And I think the biggest failure of comic book movies in recent years is that they just feel like bland, interchangeable, kind of cookie cutter assembly line studio product, as opposed to trying to take like Hollywood movies and make them feel more like comics. And I think one of the reasons I found myself so absorbed by this movie is that I basically felt like I'd read 12 issues of Amazing Spider-Man, where there wasn't necessarily like a story arc from start to finish, but it kind of bobbed and weaved and zigged and zagged between different characters and different storylines. And I was like, oh, that's like a year in the life of the character. And also, the movie allows the character finally to grow up, to get old. Like the beginning of the movie is this montage where we see MJ and Ned going through all their years of college and Spider-Man watching from a distance. And Tom Holland's been Spider-Man for 10 years now. Very wisely. He is no longer in high school. He's got a little age on him. He even he's like stretching out before fight scenes, and he acknowledges, I'm no longer in high school, and that's very healthy. You got to let the character grow up. When I was a little kid, Spider-Man got married to Mary Jane. I mean, like, there's no bigger sign that Spider-Man's growing up than having him marry, one of his old sweethearts from back in the day. So if you've ever been a fan of reading Spider-Man comics for any length of time, I think people will respond to that, where they do feel like this movie feels more like Marvel Comics as opposed to just a generic Hollywood movie. And I think that's going to be something that's really important for these superhero movies to remember in the future. It's not just IP. They have to feel like superhero movies. They have to feel like comic books. They have to feel like the original source material in terms of the style and flavor and the look, like what made these characters so enduringly popular for decades, long before they ever got on the screen. And I think that's one of many reasons why this movie is going to do really, really well. But just as a way of wrapping up this video, how does this movie compare? How does it rank next to some of the other movies featuring the character of Spider-Man going way back? And obviously we had a lot of Tobey, we had some Andrew Garfield, we've had a lot of Tom Holland, and we've had some animated movies. I think my favorite Spider-Man movie of all of them wouldn't even be a Spider-Man movie, but it would be a Spider-Man movie in which he appeared, and be a two-way tie between Civil War and Infinity War. I think those movies, they perfectly crystallized Tom Holland as Spider-Man and his role in relation to the rest of the MCU. And they just really put him to good use. Like, I just feel like the writing and the directing and the ensemble cast, they were just firing on all cylinders. And that's basically as good as the MCU ever was. But as far as standalone movies are concerned, Spider-Man 2 is my fave. This actually might be my favorite Tom Holland movie, and it's hard to rank No Way Home because it involves all of them. But I just feel like that movie, it reminds me a little bit of like Deadpool and Wolverine, where it's like a big giant cameo fest, but I don't feel like it's like as good as like a standalone story. This truly does feel like a great standalone Spider-Man saga. And so I think this is Tom Holland's best standalone movie. But yeah, my favorite two Spider-Man movies by far are going to be always Civil War and Infinity War, unless something else comes along. And I think the first Spider-Verse movie is really good. And of course, yeah, Spider-Man 2 is fucking excellent. It's tough to beat the emotion of Spider-Man 2. It's the full package. Mary Jane's perfect. Doc Ock's perfect. Like, everything about that movie. It's everything you want from a Spider-Man movie. And when it came along, it was such like a moment of like superhero movies leveling up, because we'd had some superhero movies at that point, but suddenly with Spider-Man 2, it's like, all right, their ambition is allowed to go much higher. But I think at this point, I've been talking for so goddamn long. It's time to edit this video, so it's time to wrap this sucker up. But I hope you enjoyed this big, long, rambling video. If so, remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. I would greatly appreciate it. Hope everybody has a great weekend at the movies. Sadly, I will not be doing a box office breakdown about this movie because I'll be out of town in Wyoming for the next couple days. But I'll be sure to post the numbers in the community tab on this channel. At any rate, I hope everybody has a great weekend, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.